Oh, fellow veterans, lend me your ears. Wait till you hear this one. In a letter, a writer in Colorado Springs. You ready for what he has to say? He has to say that veterans should be banned from four-year schools. Oh, fellow veterans, lend me your ears. Let me read this to you. CBS affiliate KKTV in Colorado Springs in Colorado say a newsletter at the University of Colorado Springs campus has been causing controversy. In the letter, the writer states that military veterans should be banned from classes at four-year universities. In addition to that, military culture was compared to that of white supremacist groups. Oh, fellow veterans, lend me your ears. Where the hell do they come up with this stuff? Okay, here's what it says. A four-year traditional university is supposed to be a place of learning, of understanding, of safety and security. However, there is an element among us who may be frustrating those goals. Who? Veterans. UCCS is known for its number of veterans who are full and part-time students, but these veterans of much of the school prides themselves on maybe hurting the university. First off, many veterans openly mock the idea of diversity and safe spaces for vulnerable members of society. This is directly in contradiction to the mission of UCCS. Many veterans utter the mantra that they do not see color. But the problem lies in their socialization into the military culture that is that of a white supremacist organization. They have been permanently tainted and are no longer fit for a four-year university. Second, many students are frightened by the presence of veterans in their classrooms. Veterans usually have an overwhelming presence in the classroom, which can distract other students. This is usually true for vulnerable individuals such as LGBTQI2SAA, my God, who have been known to be the butt of insensitive jokes made by veterans. Finally, veterans usually are associated with extremist right-wing groups such as the Tea Party and the NRA. In order to provide a safe place for all students, extremist right-wing groups must be suppressed on campus. This would include their followers, the veterans. That is not to say that veterans should not be allowed an education. Veterans should be allowed to attend trade schools or maybe even community college. But in order to protect our academic institutions, we must ban veterans from four-year universities. These words were published in the first issue of Social Justice Collective Weekly. University of Colorado Springs. Any of you guys out there, gals out there that attend that school, you'll surely want to look this group up, huh? And show them what intimidation is. For real. The school responded to the letter saying it does not reflect the school's views and has nothing to do with the institution. That being said, CBS contributors say that the letter was approved by the school before being placed on a bulletin board. According to the school, the group who published the letter can post what they want, whatever they want, because it is a free speech institution. The year 1963. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense.
October 2nd, I had returned from Vietnam. At that time, we had 16,000 military advisors. I recommended to President Kennedy and to the Security Council that we establish a plan and an objective of removing all of them within 2 years.
1963, Kennedy's Oval Office.
Say to the Congress and people that we do have a plan for reducing the exposure of U.S. combat personnel. My reservation about it is that war doesn't continue to go well. It looks like we were overly optimistic
February 25th, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson calls his Secretary of Defense, Bob McNamara.
Bob?
Yes, Mr. President.
I hate to modify your speech any, because it's been a good one, but I just wonder if we should find 2 minutes in there for Vietnam.
You know, the problem is what to say about it.
All right, I'll tell you what I would say about it. I would say that we have a commitment to Vietnamese freedom. We could pull out of there, the dominoes would fall, and that part of the world would go to the communists. We could send our Marines in there, and we could get tied down in the Third World War or another Korean action. Nobody really understands what it is out there. They're asking questions, and they're saying, why don't we do more? Well, I think this. You can have more war or you can have more appeasement. But we don't want more of either. Our purpose is to train these people, and our training is going good.
All right, sir, I'll get
I always thought it was foolish for you to make any statements about withdrawing. I thought it was bad psychologically. But you and the President thought otherwise, and I just sat silent.
The problem is...
All right, then the question is, how in the hell does McNamara think when he's losing the war that he can pull men out of it?
March 2nd, 1964, the Oval Office.
I want you to dictate to me a memorandum, a couple of pages, 4-letter words and short sentences on the situation in Vietnam, the Vietnam picture. This morning, Senator Scott said the war, which we can neither win, lose, nor drop, is evidence of an instability of ideas, a floating series of judgments, our policy of nervous conciliation, which is extremely disturbing. Do you think it's a mistake to explain about Vietnam and what we're faced with?
And McNamara's response.
Well, I do think, Mr. President, that it'd be wise for you to say as little as possible. The frank answer is we don't know what's going on out there. The signs I see coming through the cables are disturbing signs. It's a very uncertain period.
We need somebody over there that can get us better plans than we got. What I want is somebody that can lay up some plans to trap these guys and whip hell out of them. Kill some of them. That's what I want to do.
I'll try and bring something practical to meet that objective.
Okay, Bob. Thank you.
And so we continue to April 25th, 1972. Nixon and Kissinger in the White House talking about, of all things, the nuclear option.
And I still think we ought to take the rights off now. I think for that drown people, we have to calm down and start doing it. Well, no, I'd rather see some nuclear bomb. You got that ready? And that, I think, would just be too much. The nuclear bomb? Is that probably? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
Now, I know that was pretty tough to hear. Sound quality was pretty rough. So here's Daniel Ellsberg, author and the man who released the Pentagon Papers. And after releasing the Pentagon Papers, I believe it was in 1972, he was charged under the Espionage Act, facing 115 years in federal prison for the release.
All the different prisons showing the same picture, you begin to get the impression that there was a chain of command aspect, but how high does it go? It doesn't answer that. These tapes were in the Oval Office and they were kept secret for 30 years, about, just came out a year or two ago. And I want to reveal here the sound of compassionate conservatism. And remember that Nixon was, in many matters domestically, environment, and some others that don't come to my mind here. To the left of Clinton is what I was about to say. That was a welfare policy, all right? That was a different political environment, and he would have fit right into this political environment very happily. But at that time, his policies were reasonably compassionate on the domestic front. To think that they were very different on the foreign policy front would, I believe, be a mistake. So the chance of hearing then what has been happening in the Oval Office lately, I think, is pretty well demonstrated by what was happening in 1972 with respect to Vietnam. And I'll just give you a little of that from my book here. I did some tapes. I copied these tapes myself with my wife. We went over and over them. The tapes are available now from the National Archives. You can actually get copies of the tapes, which wasn't true when I made these transcriptions. I had put out the Pentagon Papers in 1971. This was a year later. The most heavy bombing in history was about to begin, a year after the Pentagon Papers. So anyone who thinks that any one act ended that war, or that the Pentagon Papers did, is very mistaken. Well, went on for years after. But in 72, he was on the verge of launching the heaviest bombing ever in North Vietnam, and or in the world, actually. So Nixon is talking to, on April 25th, 1972, Nixon is talking to Henry Kissinger on this tapes. We've got to stop thinking in terms, I've heard these tapes a lot, so I can... I do Kissinger better when I have a cold, but we've got to stop thinking in terms of a 3-day strike. We've got to be thinking in terms of an all-out bombing attack, which will continue until they, now by all bombing attack, I am thinking about things that go far beyond. I'm thinking of the dikes, I'm thinking of the railroad, I'm thinking, of course, of the docks. I agree with you. We've got, no, not Vive, no, that's wrong guy there. We've got to use massive force. 2 hours later, he's talking to Ziegler, his press agent, public affairs officer, and H.R. Haldeman with Kissinger and Nixon, president. How many did we kill in Laos? Ziegler. Maybe 10,000, 15? Thing, we killed about 10, 15. See, the attack in the north that we have in mind, power plants, whatever's left, POL, petroleum, the docks. And I still think we ought to take the dikes out now. Will that drown people? About 200,000 people. No, no, no. I'd rather use the nuclear bomb. Have you got that, Henry? That, I think, would be just too much. The nuclear bomb, does that bother you? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sakes. So a week later, on May 2nd, now I'm getting there, he's saying, we had to give us back our prisoners. America will not be defeated. We must not lose in Vietnam, so we must draw the sword. So the blockade is on. And I must say that I like it. And the blockade was to be accompanied by B-52 bombing for the first time in all of North Vietnam. And I want this clearly understood. The surgical operation theory is all right, but I want that place bombed to smithereens. If we draw the sword, we're going to bomb those bastards all over the place. Let it fly, let it fly. May 4th, that was May 2nd. He's in the office with Kissinger, Al Haig, and John Connally, about to do the bombing. The heavy starts a day or two later, and he's thumping his desk as he points to an imaginary or maybe a real map on it. And I went over and over with my wife to get the thumps in the right place here in the book, so nobody would accuse me if they listened to the tape, which you can do, of that's wrong, the thump wasn't there, and so forth. Vietnam, here's those little right in there, here they are. Here's the United States. Here's Western Europe, that cocky little place that's caused so much devastation. Here's the Soviet Union. Here's the Mideast. Here's the silly Africans and the not quite so silly Latin Americans. Here we are. They're taking on the United States. Now, damn it, we're going to do it. We're going to cream them. This is not in anger or anything. This old business that I'm petulant, that's all bullshit. I should have done it long ago. I just didn't follow my instincts. I'll see that the United States does not lose. I'm putting it quite bluntly. I'll be quite precise. South Vietnam may lose, but the United States cannot lose, which means basically I have made the decision. Whatever happens to South Vietnam, we are going to cream North Vietnam. For once, we've got to use the maximum power of this country against this little country to win the war. We can't use the word win, but others can. And finally, that afternoon, he says to Kissinger, the only place where you and I disagree, Henry, is with regard to the bombing. You're so goddamn concerned about the civilians, and I don't give a damn. I don't care. I'm concerned about the civilians because I don't want the world to be mobilized against you as a butcher. If you think that the conversation in the latest White House, the current White House, sounded different from that on the tapes we may hear 30 years from now, if ever, I think you'd be mistaken. That is the sound of empire. That is the sound of an American president with his finger on the button and confronted with a defiant, non-deferential little country. We tortured a country of Vietnam, but it did not win the war for us. And it will not win the war here. I say that not in praise of any adversaries there, but simply in recognition that people fighting against foreign invaders and having shown an ability and a willingness to give their lives to kill foreigners in their country are not going to give up. That's my guess. So that's the connection between Iraq and Vietnam. Thank you.
Okay, that was Daniel Ellsberg speaking to a group at the University of California. I think it was in Santa Barbara. What I want to do now, and what I wanted to do with that, is I wanted you to hear exactly what was going on in the White House. The tapes that we heard were very difficult to understand, but having the transcript in front of him, he was able to go through and show the desperation that was going on with the President of the United States, with Henry Kissinger and with their staff in trying to resolve this war. They would stop at nothing, including the use of nukes, including taking down dikes and killing 200,000 people, civilians and military too, enemy, but civilians too, women, children, flooding them out and killing them. As Kissinger said, the toll would be about 200,000. They would stop at nothing. Would they betray their friends? Would they betray friendly countries? Would they betray their allies? Of course. And that's what I'm getting at here. I'm getting at the false flags that the United States has been involved in. And we're going to talk about one. But first, we need to go forward a little bit. Actually, we need to go backward and hear a little more of their plans.
We start tonight with some rather jaw-dropping information about American politics that has been reported out by a British news source. It's the BBC. The BBC has just aired a new documentary based on Oval Office tapes, which proves something about the American presidency and American modern history that even the most conspiratorial among us would not be able to believe were it not all captured on tape. But apparently, it's all captured on tape. Here's what happened. Okay, it's about the 1968 presidential election. In that election, the Democratic side was kind of in trouble, in that the Democratic electorate was really split. They were not at all unified behind their candidate. On the right, Southern white Democrats, they were being peeled off to vote for George Wallace, the former Alabama governor. And so the Dixiecrats are getting peeled off from the Democrats that year. And also, different problem for the Democrats, people hated the Vietnam War. And the president at the time was a Democrat, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ. The escalation in Vietnam was on him. So if you were against the war, as most Americans at that point were, this is the Gallup polling on the war at that time, this is the number of people who thought the war was a mistake, that number going up and up and up over time. If you were against the war, as increasingly everybody was, you were not psyched to vote for LBJ's successor in the Democratic Party. Right? So the Democrats were losing their appeal in the South because of race and racism, and they were losing the anti-war vote because Vietnam was their war. Well, the Republican candidate that year, trying to take advantage of that split on the Democratic side, was this handsome devil. candidate Dick Nixon, Richard Nixon, in 1968, was running against a Democratic Party that he knew was split. He was, in response, pledging to get rid of the draft. And he claimed to have a plan to end the war. He argued that if you wanted the war to end, you needed to elect him. You needed to vote the Democrats out of office, because clearly LBJ and his party, the Democrats and their Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, they had no idea how to end the war. If you wanted the war to end, what you needed was Nixon. What you needed was total change at the White House. The Democrats had to go so Dick Nixon could come in and end Vietnam. But then, less than a week before the election, it all went horribly wrong for Richard Nixon. Because less than a week before the election, it was 5 nights before Election Day, on Halloween night, 1968, the Democratic president, LBJ, went on TV in a surprise, nationally televised address. He made a surprise announcement that peace was at hand. The communist side, the North Vietnamese side, was going to make major concessions at peace talks. The U.S. anticipating that the other side, the South Vietnamese, were going to agree to a deal based on those concessions. Peace was at hand. The terms were all set. Peace was at hand. In recognition of the fact that peace was about to be declared, the United States would step back right away and stop all military operations in Vietnam. LBJ said that on a Thursday night. The election was going to be the following Tuesday. Turns out the Democrats do know how to end this war that the country hated. So this was bad news for Richard Nixon for that election, right? Bad news for Richard Nixon, but good news for the country who wanted the war to be over. Good news certainly for the people who were fighting the war. This was good news, right? Almost. Thursday night, LBJ made that announcement that peace was about to be agreed to by all sides in Vietnam. That was Thursday night. By Saturday morning, never mind, deal was off. Peace was not at hand because the South Vietnamese side had decided actually it didn't want the deal. In fact, they didn't even want to talk about a deal. They pulled out of the peace talks. And so the war was back on. What happened? What happened between Thursday and Saturday? Now we know.
Hello. Good morning, Mr. President. How are you, my friend? Pretty good. Well, I've got one this morning that's pretty rough for you. We have found that our friend, the Republican nominee, our California friend, has been playing on the outskirts with our enemies and our friends both. He's been doing it through rather subterranean sources here. And he has been saying to the Allies that you're going to get sold out. You better not give away your liberty just a few hours before I can preserve it for you. Mrs. Chenault is contacting their ambassador. Now, this is not guesswork. Mrs. Chenault, she's young and attractive. I mean, she's a pretty good-looking girl. And she's around town. And she is warning them to not get pulled in on this Johnson move.
President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1968, Saturday morning, November 1st, explaining to Senator Richard Russell what had gone wrong with this peace deal that everybody thought was going to end the war. I mean, LBJ had been so sure this was going to end the war that he went on TV Thursday night and told the country the war was going to end. Peace was at hand. The reason peace did not happen, is what he was explaining on the phone, is that the Republican nominee for president that year, Richard Nixon, had intervened in the peace talks to blow them up. He used an intermediary who was involved in the talks to approach the South Vietnamese side and tell them, don't do it. Approach them and tell them to pull out and not agree to a deal. He told them this deal being worked out by LBJ, this whole deal to end the war, these peace talks in Paris, is not going to be a good deal for them. They should not participate. They should just wait until after the election when he, Richard Nixon, would be president and he'd give them a much better deal. Johnson was going to sell them out. He, Richard Nixon, was the one who they should deal with. Nixon's intermediary was actually caught on tape telling the South Vietnamese ambassador, just hang on through the election. Hang on, don't end the war. We need the war to keep going through the election. It's outrageous, right? I mean, the war could have ended. It was on the verge of ending, except a candidate for office in our country thought that the war ending would help his opponent in the election. He thought he'd have a better chance of getting elected if the war kept going. And so, while saying he wanted the war to end, He did what he could to keep it going when it otherwise would have ended. It is astonishing. And President Johnson thought so too at the time. We now know.
And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know. I think it would shock America if a principal candidate was playing with a source like this on a matter this important. Yeah.
President Lyndon Johnson there on the same day as that earlier tape, remarking that as far as he can tell, this is treason. I do not think he is saying that hyperbolically. He says it repeatedly on these tapes. He thinks that what has happened there, an American politician purposely prolonging the war and stopping the peace for his own purposes, he thinks that is a hanging offense. He thinks that is treason. This was 4 days before the election that year. Having thought that the war was going to be over, that a peace deal had been negotiated, now the president finds out that the peace deal fell through because a candidate who wanted there not to be peace before the election intervened to make one side walk away. Now, why didn't LBJ say anything publicly? I mean, this is right before the election. Can you imagine how the country would have reacted to that? This is a war the whole country was against. It was going to be over, except candidate Dick Nixon intervened to undo the peace deal and keep the war going. Can you imagine how angry the American public would have been? But LBJ did not say anything publicly at the time because he thought that he couldn't. And the reason he thought he couldn't is because of the way he found out what Nixon had done. The FBI illegally wiretapped the phones of the South Vietnamese ambassador. That's how we knew. We couldn't let anybody know that we were illegally listening into the ambassador's phone lines, and so they couldn't let anybody know what it was they heard illegally while they were illegally listening in on the ambassador's phone lines. And so Nixon got away with it. And the October surprise, the Halloween night surprise that the Democrats' war was ending right before the election, that October surprise ended up getting undone. The war did keep going, and anybody who was anti-war in the country really did have no reason at all to vote for a Democrat. And so, yes, the Republican, Richard Nixon, won. It worked. Richard Nixon got elected, barely. Squeaked by, but he won, in part on the basis of the idea that he was the guy who knew how to end the war, not those dumb Democrats. And of course, Nixon did not know how to end the war. He sure knew how to keep it going, but he didn't know how to end it. He didn't have a plan. And instead of the war ending on Halloween in 1968, the war went on for 5 more years while he was president, in which time more than 15,000 Americans were killed, as were untold numbers of Vietnamese. So that happened. That actually happened. And now, in 2013, what are we supposed to do with that information? LBJ is dead. Nixon is dead. Hubert Humphrey is dead. George Wallace is dead. 15,000 Americans are dead who otherwise would not have been because of what happened. All the Vietnamese who died. How does this get made right? It cannot be made right in the most basic sense that the people who died needlessly because of this duplicitous political decision cannot be brought back from the dead. You also can't get revenge. You can't indict Nixon's ghost. But you can't refuse to let him get away with it again. You can't make sure it is part of the way that we at least tell his history and the history of that war and the history of modern American politics. You have to include it in the history, both so nobody gets away with it in the long run the way he did in the short run, but also so we don't do it again. So we at least know something like this is possible. So we at least don't dismiss this kind of possibility as some conspiracy theory bit of nonsense. So we at least know there is precedent, modern precedent, for this particular kind of craven evil.
This level of deception is horrific. How many American soldiers died because of this? The deal was in place. The war was going to end. The soldiers were coming home. Well, I can tell you about how many soldiers died because of this little move of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Around 38,000 soldiers died, and even more captured in the years after 1968 in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the real numbers out of Laos and Cambodia we may never know. How many civilians, how many children? Because of this great deception and this great deceiver. Let's go on a little farther. Now we're going to hear about a different issue. We're going to hear about a president who comes into office, who the minute he comes into office, intelligence violations being thrown out to the media throwing out there, and the president thinking the media is his enemy. Well, you know what it is. You've heard it all over the news lately. But you probably haven't heard this part of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America and Mrs. Nixon.
He had so many deep-seated hatreds.
There are a lot of good qualities about Nixon that were buried with Watergate. Nixon, Watergate. Nixon, Watergate. What do you remember about Richard Nixon? Watergate.
Richard Nixon was so much more, but his presidency was overshadowed by demons that drove him to criminal excess.
He is subject to the rule of law and to justice. He will get it, be he president or be he pauper.
He left behind hours of recorded conversations that augured his demise.
We cannot have our people get soft because of they're trying to suck up to some of these goddamn newspaper people. Now, goddamn it, I'm not going to have it. It isn't worth it. That's it. That's the way it's going to be.
Nixon described his career as a journey to the mountaintop and to the despair of life's deepest valley.
He said, in the Army, Al, you have a solution to this. When you have a disgraced leader, you put a pistol in his desk drawer, and he takes care of the rest.
Our little girl, Tricia, named Check.
This time we're going to win!
All American forces will be withdrawn. I have never been a quitter.
To understand the man, we need to look back in his history, see where he came from, what he was about. Because what he had done, what he had cost the American people, think about this. I'm serious now, think about had he not been put into office. Think about the war ending in Vietnam. Where would I be? Well, I wouldn't have gone in the military. My life would have drastically changed. How about those thousands of MIAs? The thousands of KIAs. What would have life been like without an extended Vietnam? Think about it. You listening out there who lost family members, friends. You who served in the military. Involuntarily, by the way, many of you. What would your life be like? Your friends who died post-Vietnam of drug addiction, of psychological problems, alcohol addiction. What would their lives have been like? Look at what this man did to America. Now let's listen to this.
In the long history of the Republic, only one man has ever been forced to resign the office of the presidency. On August 9th, 1974, Richard Milhouse Nixon gathered those who served him for so long to say goodbye.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
That day, Nixon knew instinctively the price he paid for the resentments that consumed his presidency.
Nixon had in his character a dark side and a light side. The light side was often full of very clever thoughts, good instincts, but it was in conflict with this dark side, which was the mean streak in Nixon, the hater in Nixon, the paranoic in Nixon. And it was a dark side which rose during the presidency into the ascendant.
To understand the accomplishments and the propensity for self-destruction, you need to understand the long journey that brought him to the presidency. It was a remarkable political odyssey. Born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, 30 miles east of Los Angeles, a million miles west of Washington. It was an upbringing marked by struggle and tragedy. 2 brothers dying of tuberculosis, a family battling the ravages of the Depression. For Nixon, it left scars of social inferiority that he carried with him all the way to the White House.
He is a classic kind of up from the bootstraps character, a sort of Horatio Alger sort of figure. And he makes it, but he never gets over those resentments. He can never shed them, toss them aside.
Those resentments first surfaced during the 1952 race for the presidency. He was Dwight Eisenhower's running mate. He was almost dropped from the ticket after the national press alleged he was supporting his family with a private slush fund, a charge he vigorously rejected.
Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Richard Nixon.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned.
As he laid out the family finances, what they owned and what they owed, he insisted there was one gift he had no intention of giving back.
It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog, black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
Nixon really saved his career from destruction by this address. The American people responded to it, and they overwhelmingly flooded the Republican National Committee with letters and phone calls and telegrams in support of Nixon. And Eisenhower at this point was boxed into a corner. He had no choice now but to keep Nixon on the ticket.
It was a strategy that worked, but left a deep sense of resentment directed at the National Press Corps. Nixon went on to serve for 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president, service which provided a springboard for the Republican nomination in 1960. The problem was he was up against the charismatic John F. Kennedy. Nixon lost that race by a wafer-thin margin, just 113,000 votes out of the 68 million cast. That defeat was followed 2 years later by a humiliating loss to Pat Brown, the incumbent governor of California, a loss Nixon blamed on unfair reporting by a press corps he was convinced had been conspiring since 1952 to engineer his defeat.
As I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
This was a moment of truth for Richard Nixon, a rare moment of truth when the carefully constructed facade that he tried to present to the public is broken through, and his real emotions, his real anger, his resentments, his self-pity come to the surface in a way that politicians try never to let happen. This is the real Nixon.
The press wrote his political obituary. They wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore, or so they thought.
Tonight, I again proudly accept that nomination for President of the United States.
Defying the odds, Nixon staged a remarkable comeback in 1968.
But I have news for you. This time there's a difference. This time we're going to win.
A resurrection made possible by the discordant sounds of the times. Anger and recrimination had replaced civility and tolerance at the heart of the national debate. One overwhelming issue fueled the rising chorus of discontent. Vietnam.
Never has so much power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
What gives him the opportunity to run and win the presidency is the failure of Lyndon Johnson to deal effectively with the Vietnam War. Johnson escalates the war beginning in 65, 66, 67. By 1968, there are 545,000 American troops in Vietnam, and the country is thirsting for a victory or an end to the conflict.
Nixon beat Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, by less than 1% of the popular vote.
I had a telephone conversation with the vice president. I know exactly how he felt. I know how it feels to lose a close one.
A victory that left in its wake adversaries who were unwilling to accept the legitimacy of the nation's verdict.
He had a huge store of enemies. Many of them felt they were doing the Lord's work or were being patriotic by trying to destroy Richard Nixon.
When Richard Nixon assumed the presidency in January 1969, the nation was at war and the world seemed on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. It was the greatest set of challenges facing any incoming president since the end of the Second World War. But on that cold winter's day, Nixon announced that he relished the challenge.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment, that we helped make the world safe for mankind.
That is one twisted mind son of a bitch. Can you believe that he even approached it in that manner? Well, I can. I worked for him. Evil? You bet your sweet buttons he's evil. He was evil. And I'm sure he's paying the price now where he is. Let's listen to a little more.
He started his administration by building a White House staff designed to isolate and protect the president from friend and foe alike.
He was a solitary fellow, and as he himself said, he was a desperate introvert in a business of extroverts. Most politicians can't stand to be alone, and Richard Nixon couldn't stand to be with people. And he wanted a structure built around him to prevent that kind of contact.
No one could see Nixon without first being screened by the Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, an advertising executive who had been at Nixon's side since 1956.
Haldeman was the gatekeeper in the sense that he not only kept people out from seeing Nixon, but he also guarded against going ahead and implementing things that Nixon would suggest they should do, which Haldeman made the judgment should not be done because they were too erratic, they were too radical, too extreme, and that they could jeopardize the Nixon presidency.
Any assurance that if we put federal money...
Another member of the tight inner circle was John Ehrlichman. These two formidable aides, both Christian scientists, German descent, erected what became known as the Berlin Wall. Behind the barricade was Alexander Haig, who would serve 5 presidents. He found Nixon's style a reflection of the man.
He had a double Achilles heel. One was the anguishing manner in which he made a decision. The other was a shyness, a deep shyness. Nobody really knew Richard Nixon, and I'm not sure to this day I did. I found him to be very, very much appalled by the thought of a confrontation, one-on-one, with anybody.
One of those who experienced Nixon's social awkwardness was Alexander Butterfield. As Haldeman's principal assistant, he was told that it was imperative that the initial meeting with Nixon go well.
There were only 3 of us in the room. 2 of us had spoken. Now it's the president's turn. And he began to growl. I couldn't understand. I heard this guttural sound. And he sort of went, well, yeah, I could not believe it. This is the worst situation I had ever been in. It really was. It was all going to be so simple. The man never said anything. He never uttered one word. It just growled.
After 2 minutes, the introduction came to an abrupt end. Haldeman led Butterfield out, muttering this was exactly what he had feared would happen.
Naturally, I didn't want to bomb meeting the president. Who would think that a handshake would go badly?
Butterfield kept his job, but Nixon tried to prevent just this sort of awkward exchange by meticulously preparing for meetings. Dr. Henry Kissinger, a 46-year-old Harvard academic, was Nixon's national security advisor.
Kissinger looked upon Nixon as one of the oddest people he had ever met. Somebody deeply insecure, but absolutely brilliant. Somebody he could work with. First time, second time, third time, Kissinger went in there to talk to him. Nixon would prepare for it by writing a whole legal page of what he was going to say, and then he would memorize the notes and throw the legal pad away so he could pretend to have a normal conversation, but he had to work himself up to it.
This atmosphere in the White House bred secrecy that Nixon would count on as he prepared for one of the most daunting challenges of his presidency, to find a way out of the quagmire of Vietnam, a challenge that would bring out the best and the worst in Richard Nixon. By January 1969, the Vietnam War had taken more than 31,000 American lives. Nixon told aides the success of his presidency rested on his ability to bring the conflict to an end.
I sat in the meeting where he spoke to the cabinet, and he said, I'm going to be out of Vietnam within the year. We're going to withdraw. And we're going to do it by a combination of pressure on the battlefield and negotiations, which are serious and professional, and which go beyond Hanoi to their mentor and their catechist, the Soviet Union.
Nixon believed improved relations with the Soviets were possible, but only if Moscow restrained its communist ally in Hanoi, a strategy the North Vietnamese undermined from the beginning.
In the third week of the presidency, on the day before the president was leaving for a trip to Europe, the North Vietnamese started an offensive that killed between 400 and 600 Americans a week.
It was one of the highest casualty rates of the war. On March 16, 1969, to stave off a South Vietnamese defeat, Nixon ordered an expansion of the air war into neighboring Cambodia. Although supposedly neutral, the country had long served as a transit route for communist forces heading south.
That bombing was undertaken to show both Moscow, Hanoi, and all of their minions that the United States was going to take action.
Nixon had a madman theory that if people were frightened of him, if they had no idea what he would do, he would seem tough and irrational. And so the Vietnamese would be scared. They'd come to the table. They'd make a deal.
The Cambodian campaign was to be conducted in total secrecy.
Nixon had a penchant for secrecy. This is what brought him down. It partly had to do with his paranoia. It partly had to do with the fact that he did not believe he could persuade the American people to come along with him. It also had to do with the fact that he didn't have a feel for democracy and openness as being a strength of our foreign policy. Nixon was doing things not only secretly, but secretly from the State Department, secretly from his own cabinet, secretly from all of his other advisors.
Next, you're going to hear from General Alexander Haig. You're going to hear of the problems that followed in the White House, and it may sound a little bit familiar to the problems we're seeing today in the White House. Take a listen.
2.5 years before the release of the Pentagon Papers, national newspapers started publishing top-secret documents and leaks from classified White House meetings.
We began the administration with massive hemorrhaging of the most sensitive information from day one, the first National Security Council meeting, in which we laid out our strategy with the Soviet Union, was leaked to the New York Times within 24 hours of the meeting. It got so that we were delivering the summaries of what was decided only to the principals themselves, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA, and still it was leaking.
As anti-war protests grew, hundreds of thousands of protesters filed into the streets. The Oval Office finally realized something must be done, and something must be done quickly.
In an attempt to discover the source of the leaks, Nixon ordered FBI taps installed on several members of Kissinger's own NSC staff. He then went after those writing the stories. Wiretaps were placed on the home lines of journalists working for the Washington Post and the New York Times. Within 4 months of taking office, Nixon viewed the Fourth Estate with suspicion bordering on contempt.
He went his way without thinking about the press. He didn't spend any time with the press. He didn't understand the press are the first historians. The first rough draft of history in this town is written by journalists.
That first draft reflected a growing unease over the president's Vietnam policy. In October 1969, hundreds of thousands of Americans took part in protests across the nation. Nixon insisted he was unmoved by those denouncing the expansion of the conflict. For their part, the protesters insisted it was no longer Lyndon Johnson's folly. Now, it was Richard Nixon's war.
The President of the United States said nothing you young kids would do would have any effect on him. Well, I suggest to the President of the United States, if he want to know how much effect you youngsters can have on the President, he should make one long-distance phone call to the LBJ Ranch and ask that boy how much effect you can have.
As the protest movement grew, allies on Capitol Hill warned the president he was too isolated. Bryce Harlow, the head of Congressional Liaison, lobbied Nixon to widen his circle by hiring Chuck Colson, a bright activist lawyer who could get things done.
He said, Chuck, I got you in here because somebody's got to break the Berlin Wall of Holman and Ehrlichman. And he said, I figure you're the guy that can do it. The second thing he said to me is, when you walk around here, always walk with your back to the wall. He said, you will find that somebody else will have a knife out for you any place you are in the White House. The Nixon White House reflected the personality of the boss. The paranoia and the rivalries, the competitions within the White House, it's really quite startling.
The president told his staff he needed time alone to decide his next step, whether to significantly expand the war by invading Cambodia with ground troops. It would be one of the most momentous decisions of the Nixon presidency.
What do? The air campaign didn't work. Nothing seems to be working. He needed to get South Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian troops involved. He needed their assistance. Unfortunately, Lon Nol, who ended up in a coup and taking over Cambodia, Lon Nol was a fence setter. He was more than happy to take aid and protect troops and supplies coming in from China, coming in from Russia, transiting through Cambodia, and down into the combat zones. So he was receiving arms, he was receiving weapons, troops were receiving training in Cambodia, and I'm talking about enemy troops, not friendly troops. It would be a difficult task to get him involved. But there was one thing he could do, and that'll come up in a little while. But first, let's listen to this.
Richard Nixon found solace and solitude at Camp David. He went to the mountain retreat more than 160 times during the 5.5 years of his presidency. More visits than any of his predecessors, 3 times as many as Eisenhower made during 8 years in office. Closed to the press, there is scant photographic record of his visits. But in the shadow of the presidential retreat lies Trout Run. Built for President Herbert Hoover, it helps us recreate the atmosphere that brought Nixon back time and again, an oasis of peace to inspire a course out of war.
He loved being alone and sort of darkly brooding and then writing things down on a pad. And so he would make a decision and sometimes just pick up the phone and bark an order. Sometimes it was a barked order that should be taken seriously, and sometimes it was a barked order that was sort of a late night thing where Nixon was testing out some proposal, like just bomb them, or just send in troops, or just invade.
In the early spring of 1970, it was clear the bombing of Cambodia had failed to wipe out communist sanctuaries. Nixon asked the Pentagon to send to Camp David military options to end the war in Vietnam. After 10 tortuous days, often alone on his mountaintop, Nixon was ready to announce his decision. Thousands of American ground troops were ordered into Cambodia. America would shorten the war through intimidation and escalation.
It is not our power, but our will and character that is being tested tonight.
By the time he spoke, 6,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were already fighting inside Cambodia. They met fierce resistance as they tried to eradicate communist encampments.
I would rather be a one-term president and do what I believe was right than to be a 2-term president at the cost of seeing America become a second-rate power and to see this nation accept the first defeat in its proud 190-year history.
The way it's read by millions of people in the United States, and particularly by the press and by the president's adversaries, is that he's now expanding the war to another country, and that instead of winding down the war, he's revving it up.
By May 4th, 1970, the campus of Kent State University had seen 3 days of sometimes violent protest. The Ohio governor had sent in the National Guard to restrain the students. It was an incendiary mix. The divisions that were ripping America apart, the anger, the mistrust, the resentments, all coalesced in a moment of national shame. Gunfire lasted only seconds, but left 4 students dead. It ignited a firestorm. 450 campuses closed down in protest. Students came to Washington hoping to bring the capital to its knees.
The city was on camp. The mobs were smashing windows, slashing tires, dragging parked cars into intersections, even throwing bed springs off overpasses into the traffic down below. This was the, quote, student protest. That's not student protest, that's civil war.
The 82nd Airborne was in the basement of the executive office building, so I went down just to talk to some of the guys and walk among them. And They're lying on the floor with leaning on their packs and their helmets and their cartridge belts and their rifles cocked, and you're thinking, this can't be the United States of America. This is not the greatest free democracy in the world. This is a nation at war with itself.
Nixon was flown to Camp David for his own protection. There, alone for 2 days, he brooded, fearful that his administration, indeed the country, was teetering on the precipice.
He was as close to a breakdown, maybe nervous exhaustion, not sure what the clinical description would have been. He was right on the edge.
Nixon returned to Washington on May 8th. That evening, the sounds of protest echoed around the White House grounds. Between 10 p.m. and 4 the next morning, telephone logs reveal 47 outgoing calls on Nixon's line. They included the Reverend Billy Graham, and 7 calls each to Henry Kissinger and Bob Haldeman. Nixon had not slept in 2 days.
I was in the Secret Service command post around 4:15 in the morning, and over the speaker comes Searchlight is on the lawn. Searchlight is the Secret Service code name for the president. And I was immediately astounded at what's he doing outside the White House at 4:15 in the morning.
Nixon's car disappeared into the night. It was heading toward the student encampment in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial.
I'm walking up the stairs of the Lincoln Memorial. The president is standing there in a group of about 30 protesters, talking with them. And I joined in there at the back of the group to listen to what he was saying. And it was, I thought, a very significant and major effort to reach out to understand what they were feeling and to show some empathy for what they were doing. I mean, it was a real sense, at least that I derived from it, of trying to reach out to these people.
But the encounter at the Lincoln Memorial simply deepened the divisions and mistrust on both sides. Nixon now began to look for a more sinister cause for the nation's growing turmoil.
He does believe that the student groups and that many of the people who are involved in this are being manipulated by foreign communist influence. And he's ordering the CIA and the FBI to find the information to demonstrate this. They come back to him and they say they can't find anything. And he tells them, go back and look again.
The U.S. Army also spied on Americans believed to be responsible for the escalating anarchy. Begun under Johnson and escalated under Nixon, files on 18,000 students were kept on Pentagon computers.
You had to do something. The country was tearing itself apart, and this was not just an isolated thing, it was emblematic of the breakdown of civilized life in the U.S.
Nixon ordered Tom Houston of his White House staff to devise a new strategy to hunt down and destroy the leadership of the anti-war movement.
The Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, called me over and said, here is a plan that was developed by Tom Houston to deal with a very serious problem the President wants addressed, and that is intelligence on the anti-war movement. You could infiltrate, you could do what they call black bag jobs and sneak in and burglarize to get information. Wiretapping was implicit in it. It was just a catalog of what was prohibited under the law. In fact, there were several footnotes in the document noting that these were illegal activities.
President Nixon, Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, Haldeman, the whole lot of them, didn't give a rat's ass about the law. That was brought out earlier, and later in its administration, it was brought out with break-ins. You know, break-ins and bugging officials. That continues even today. We were involved in a bugging of a Democratic headquarters in Albany, New York. Yeah, it was a CIA operation, CIA-DIA operation in the United States. We bugged the building that was going to be used in New York by the Democratic Party. So it's no stranger in politics to do this kind of thing. But what's horrible, what's deplorable, is their disregard for human life. Let's go on a little farther now.
You had to do something. The country was tearing itself apart, and this was not just an isolated thing, it was emblematic of the breakdown of civilized life in the U.S.
Nixon ordered Tom Houston of his White House staff to devise a new strategy to hunt down and destroy the leadership of the anti-war movement.
The Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, called me over and said, here is a plan that was developed by Tom Houston to deal with a very serious problem the President wants addressed, and that is intelligence on the anti-war movement. You could infiltrate, you could do what they call black bag jobs and sneak in and burglarize to get information. Wiretapping was implicit in it. It was just a catalog of what was prohibited under the law. In fact, there were several footnotes in the document noting that these were illegal activities.
Reluctant to challenge J. Edgar Hoover, the enormously powerful director of the FBI, Nixon ordered that the Houston plan be shelved. But it showed the senior staff how far the president was willing to go to bring down those he perceived to be his enemies. Ahead for Nixon, one of the most destructive decisions he ever made. He ordered H.R. Haldeman to install bugs and wiretaps in his White House offices and at Camp David. Ultimately, there would be thousands of hours of recordings revealing criminal activity and character flaws that would bring down his presidency.
So there you hear it. In the Nixon administration, they would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Legal issues did not exist. Ethical issues did not exist. And that's absolutely apparent when you look at what happened during the election. The October surprise that Nixon provided. Now, earlier in the broadcast, we heard the announcer and the journalist. We heard from General Haig. We've heard from Kissinger. We've heard from his secretary, White House secretary. We've heard from all of them, and all of those conversations and that picture they were trying to paint of Nixon was before the tapes were let out, whereby we now know what happened in that election. We now know that the Vietnam War could have ended in 1968. We now know how many American lives were lost just because of that play. So America's in turmoil. Rioters in the streets, anti-protesters in the streets, other governments eyeing the United States warily. Nixon needs to make his move. He needs to win Vietnam, or he needs to get out of Vietnam. And what does he need to do for that to happen? He's got to have support of the South Vietnamese, the Laotian, and the Cambodian armies. He has to have that. Now, Lon Nol is a fence setter. He was the prime minister 2 times, and in a 1970 coup, actually deemed himself president. But he was receiving help and aid from the Russians, the Chinese, and from us, and from the South Vietnamese. We needed to get him on board. We needed to get him on board against the North Vietnamese. And so to accomplish that goal, he went to his military advisors, his very close military advisors, and he asked them for plans. Excuse me. I need plans. I need plans on what we can do here. Joint Chiefs brought in plans, Secretary of State brought in plans, NSA advisor brought in plans, but the plan that he chose was brought in by the CIA. And the CIA's plan is simply to form an operation to cause Lon Nol to get off the fence. How do we do that? And that's what the ensuing discussion was all about. How do we do that? What do we do to get this man off the fence so that he will join in combat against the North Vietnamese, against the Cong? What can we do? A false flag. We can go in, we can attack him a vital portion of his regime, dressed as Viet Cong. That should get him off the fence, get him out of supporting the Chinese, who were also supplying the Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, the Russians, who were also supplying the Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, would get him off the fence and get him to ask the United States, who is already there, for more help. So what happened? They sent Haig and Colby to Southeast Asia. The plan was hatched. The plan was called Operation RedRock. The team was assembled in NKP, Thailand, the home of Task Force Alpha. Task Force Alpha was tasked with supplying the intelligence and support for the mission. The original 13-man team consisted of 8 U.S. Army Green Beret, 3 Navy SEALs, and 2 civilians, CIA. The training was performed over a 4-week period at NKP, Thailand. Washington chose the target. It was now a go. Phnom Penh Airport, January 1971. This 13-man team was tasked with jumping in to the airport, jumping into Cambodia, moving to the airport, attacking the airport, leaving dead North Vietnamese, Viet Cong sappers on the airport grounds. How did they do that? A nice tandem jump into Cambodia, carrying sappers with them with the promise it was a prisoner exchange. Those sappers were left dead on the tarmac. The team dressed as sappers. The weapons, Chinese and Russian equipment. Nothing was left. Nothing was left out in the planning stage of this mission. Unfortunately, during the training period, the communications person had an accident and was unable to continue. What happened then? I was at NKP. I was in Task Force Alpha. We were there to support Air America and other airlines who were working in the zone. And lucky me, got thrown involuntarily into Team RedRock. Results of the mission was highly successful. Even to this day, the newspapers will tout how successful that North Vietnamese raid on Phnom Penh Airport was. But Washington put it out. No one can ever know. No one can ever know that we betrayed our allies. So how do they keep that a secret? Well, that's pretty simple. With the evil empire in Washington of the Nixon administration, Team RedRock will never return. 2 of us did return. Out of the 13-man team, 2 of us lived to tell the story. Pop died a few years ago. That was our platoon sergeant. I'm still alive, and I'm telling the story. Team RedRock was successful. Days after the raid, actually the day after the raid, Lon Nol wired for help to the United States government. Equipment was standing by. It was immediately shipped in. Troops were immediately shipped in. Reparation to the airport was at hand. So it was successful. Lon Nol moved over, got in bed with the United States government, had his troops training with the South Vietnamese. Unfortunately, it was just too late in the game to have much effect. We dilly-dallied around down there too long without letting the generals do their job, by letting the politicians run the show. And as we all know, historically, Vietnam fell. That's our show for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I did write a book called Operation RedRock. It's available at chiptatum.com. You can go online and buy it, and it'll be shipped right to you. That's chiptatum.com. Under the bookstore, you'll find Operation RedRock. You'll also find the Tatum Chronicles. That's another story that I had written that is chronicled during the Iran-Contra controversy of drug running on board military aircraft. With the proof. All of it's right there. Oh, fellow veterans, lend me your ears. Wait till you hear this one. In a letter, a writer in Colorado Springs. You ready for what he has to say? He has to say that veterans should be banned from 4-year schools. Oh, fellow veterans, lend me your ears. Let me read this to you. CBS affiliate KKTV in Colorado Springs in Colorado say a newsletter at the University of Colorado Springs campus has been causing controversy. In the letter, the writer states that military veterans should be banned from classes at 4-year universities. In addition to that, military culture was compared to that of white supremacist groups. Oh, fellow veterans, lend me your ears. Where the hell do they come up with this stuff? Okay, here's what it says. A 4-year traditional university is supposed to be a place of learning, of understanding, of safety and security. However, there is an element among us who may be frustrating those goals. Who? Veterans. UCCS is known for its number of veterans who are full and part-time students, but these veterans of much of the school prides themselves on maybe hurting the university. First off, many veterans openly mock the idea of diversity and safe spaces for vulnerable members of society. This is directly in contradiction to the mission of UCCS. Many veterans utter the mantra that they do not see color. But the problem lies in their socialization into the military culture that is that of a white supremacist organization. They have been permanently tainted and are no longer fit for a 4-year university. Second, many students are frightened by the presence of veterans in their classrooms. Veterans usually have an overwhelming presence in the classroom, which can distract other students. This is usually true for vulnerable individuals such as LGBTQI2SAA, my God, who have been known to be the butt of insensitive jokes made by veterans. Finally, veterans usually are associated with extremist right-wing groups such as the Tea Party and the NRA. In order to provide a safe place for all students, extremist right-wing groups must be suppressed on campus. This would include their followers, the veterans. That is not to say that veterans should not be allowed an education. Veterans should be allowed to attend trade schools or maybe even community college. But in order to protect our academic institutions, we must ban veterans from 4-year universities. These words were published in the first issue of Social Justice Collective Weekly. University of Colorado Springs. Any of you guys out there, gals out there that attend that school, you'll surely want to look this group up, huh? And show what intimidation is. For real. The school responded to the letter saying it does not reflect the school's views and has nothing to do with the institution. That being said, CBS contributors say that the letter was approved by the school before being placed on a bulletin board. According